Welcome to Christian Virtual Fellowship. This is the online church for Allegiance to the King. If you'd like to know more about Allegiance to the King, you can find us at our website at a2kchurch.org. If you're watching the video, it's right there. And or you can find us on Facebook under Allegiance to the King or Christian Virtual Fellowship. And we'd love to hear from you if you like our content that we put out. We'd really like to have you join us for our church meetings. So tonight I'm going to be looking at 1 Corinthians 14, 34, and 35. These are a couple of verses that are pretty challenging for a lot of folks. They are there's a number of different ways that people have handled these two particular verses, and they're controversial. They are especially controversial in modern times because there's a lot of people in modern times that are going to take offense to these particular verses. But I want to take a look at them and see what are some of the traditional ways that they are handled, including one of the ways that I use to explain how to handle these two verses. And then I'm gonna show you what I have come to believe is the correct understanding of how to understand these two verses in their context. So first, let's just take a look at the two verses. All right, 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 34 and 35 say, "The women are to keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but are to subject themselves, just as the law also says, if they desire to learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is improper for a woman to speak in church." So as you can probably see, that's there's a little bit no, well, not a little bit. There's a lot bit on the controversial side. I'm sure most modern women are on the surface read this and go, "Whoa, wait a minute, what?" And so we do want to understand: is this actually what the scripture says? If so, why? And how should we apply this? So what I want to do is I'm going to begin with the broader context, because one of the things that I want to do kind of through this teaching tonight is really help to show how important context is for understanding anything. That if you don't really understand the context of a passage and how the language being used in any particular part needs to be controlled by the context that it's being used in, you can really kind of take a passage like this and really misunderstand, and maybe in some really terrible ways potentially, and or create really difficult misunderstandings, just be confused, that kind of thing, until you really start to see things in their context, and suddenly they start making more sense. But you have to pay close attention to context in order to do that. So let's look at the broader context quickly. I'm going to start. All of 1 Corinthians 14 is really one context, and it itself is in a context of chapters 12, 13, and 14. But I'm going to start in verse 26 and then run through the end of the chapter, and we'll capture enough in this to understand sort of what's going on, what is Paul accomplishing in this particular area. So verse 26, he sort of asks a rhetorical question. What is the outcome then, brothers and sisters? He's been giving all these instructions. He's like, all right, so what are we supposed to do? When you assemble, each one has a psalm, has a teaching, has a revelation, has a tongue, has an interpretation. He says all of you can contribute. You can all bring things to the church meeting. However, all things are to be done for edification, because that's basically the message that he's been talking about. You guys can all do contribute in these different ways spiritually, but you've been doing it in ways that are not edifying, like speaking in tongues without interpreting and things like that. Or everybody speaking in tongues at the same time, those kinds of things. So then, so he's going to say, you can all bring it, but it needs to be done for edification. So now he's going to give some instruction. If anyone speaks in a tongue, it must be by 2 or at the most 3, right? Don't do a bunch of that, just a few. And each one in turn, take turns doing it. And one, or this is the same one, is to interpret. And verse 28, but if there is no interpreter, he is to keep silent in the church and have him speak to himself and to God, right? So if a person does speak in tongues, but they're not willing or able to interpret, then they should not speak in tongues in the church meeting. Verse 29, have 2 or 3 prophets speak and have others pass judgment. But if a revelation is made to another who is seated, then the first one is to keep silent. There's our keep silent word again. For you can all prophesy one by one, so that all may learn and all may be exhorted, and the spirits of prophets are subject to the prophets. For God is not a God of confusion, but of peace. That's the confusion that has to do with orderliness. As in all the churches of the saints, the women are to keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but are to subject themselves, just as the law also says. If they desire to learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is improper for a woman to speak in church. Or was it from you that the word of God first went out, or has it come to you only? If anyone thinks that he is a prophet or spiritual, let him recognize that the things which I am writing to you are the Lord's commandment. But if anyone does not recognize this, he is not recognized. Therefore, my brothers and sisters, earnestly desire to prophesy and do not forbid speaking in tongues, but all things must be done properly and in an orderly way. Okay, so we can kind of capture from this the basic content, the content, the point, the context of 1 Corinthians 14, actually in all. He's kind of repeated himself from the beginning of the chapter here in the last verse. And that is that spiritual things are good to do, but we need to have propriety and order. It needs to be for the purpose of edifying people. It shouldn't be about yourself. It should be about giving to others and helping and uplifting and encouraging and exhorting, those kinds of things. That's the purpose. And so, but orderly and in a way in which people are actually blessed and encouraged. Okay, that's our 2 verses fall into that context. And so, okay, so whatever they're doing, whatever they're saying, they need to be in some form or fashion communicating more of this message of things being proper and orderly and a blessing and that sort of stuff. Okay, so I want to first, before I get into what I believe the right way to interpret those 2 verses are, I want to show you some of the typical ways that scholars will explain and teachers will explain these verses. And I think I actually, as I'm thinking back through my list, I think I've left one out that I'll cover as well. So the first is women shouldn't speak in the church. Just, in fact, for a long time, the church taught that, and that they should be silent in the church meetings. There are still a few churches around today that are going to teach this in its broad generalization, that women, when they come into the church, into typically the sanctuary, they should be silent. Other people are going to take this not to mean necessarily, and this is much more common, not necessarily to say that women shouldn't speak at all in a church, but they shouldn't speak to the church, teaching and those sorts of, get up in front of the congregation and speak. And then there's still quite a few churches that teach and practice that, and this is certainly one of the places where they're going to go to support that view. So this is one, and I don't personally subscribe to this. I've never subscribed to that particular view. It is in direct contradiction not only to most of the rest of the New Testament, it's in direct contradiction to Paul in the book and the letter of First Corinthians. And so it's really, what we should do is we should immediately be suspect of that, because Paul in 1 Corinthians 11 talks about women speaking in the church in different ways. So you should look at that and go, it can't possibly mean this, but this is one of the ways that people, explain this. The next way is that these verses are a later insertion. This is actually quite common amongst a lot of the pretty well-known 20th century Bible commentators are going to go this route. And there's some reasons for that. There's sort of two reasonings for this. The first is textual evidence. These two particular verses in some of what are called the Western tradition manuscripts, ancient manuscripts, these two verses don't appear between verse 33 and verse 36. They appear after verse 40 at the end of the chapter. So that could be an indication of, an editor or copyist very early in the tradition of the church has added these verses in, and they've kind of moved around, that sort of thing. But I will say that if you do enough of your homework on this particular point, you'll find out it's not very strong evidence. Especially today. There's been a lot of scholars who have tackled this. And this is the way I used to explain it. Having read a number of 20th century commentators, I'd read the data that they put forth, people like Gordon Fee, F.F. Bruce, and others, and I'd read it and I go, okay, well that makes sense. If you actually read from verse 33 to verse 36 and just skip the two verses, it flows very nicely. It just flows perfectly. So it kind of looks like maybe it shouldn't be there from a textual standpoint. But today, generally scholars are going to go, that's really weak. The evidence for that text really is really weak. It's very easy to explain the variant manuscripts that have the verses in another place. There are no existing manuscripts that don't have these two verses, which would be a different kind of textual evidence. And so the evidence is weak. The other is contextual evidence. So this is where basically it doesn't look like Paul wrote this because it contradicts his the things that he says in other places, including 1 Corinthians 11. And so if this is to be taken as a general prohibition against women, it doesn't fit with Paul, and probably he didn't write it, in which case somebody else inserted it later on, and it probably would have had to have been very early in that case. So those are kind of some of the ways in which a lot of scholars especially used to approach this and say, well, how to understand this? Paul didn't write this. This was a later insertion by people who, believed this, and we can just toss it out. I'm gonna add one here that I really kind of left out. Another way in which scholars have addressed this is to try to argue that Paul is actually quoting the Corinthians in these two verses, and then he's going to come back in verse 36 and he's going to say, what did it come to you only? Right. And there's some good reason to believe that view. There are other passages in Paul's writing, including 1 Corinthians, where he does that very thing, where he's quoting his audience having written to him, and then he's going to address what they're saying. And so it is possible, but it's really, really difficult to say that that's what's going on with any kind of definite nature. So that argument is out there. You may have heard that argument before, but I think I personally believe it's probably going to become less and less common because this fourth one that I'm going to get into here in a few minutes is starting to be adopted by contemporary scholars, and there's a really good reason to believe it's the right answer. The third one that I've listed here, I guess it'd be fourth in our list now. There was some sort of disruptive behavior going on, and this one is really, really common among scholars to sort of either list as their primary reasoning or a fallback reasoning. If they've said, they think the primary is that somebody inserted it later, then they're going to say, but if that's not correct, then there's some sort of disruptive behavior going on, and that Paul is dealing with that, right? So, and there's a number of different ways. I'll give you a couple of them that they might explain that. One, that if this is a general prohibition with women in the church dealing with disruptive behavior, that it has to do with women at the time being largely uneducated, maybe unfamiliar with proper behavior and orderliness and being quiet in meetings and stuff like that. And it's possible. It's certainly true that most women did not receive an education. But the idea that women didn't know how to behave themselves in a meeting like this just doesn't, I don't know. I don't think it holds water. For one thing, a lot of the women at the time would have come from a Jewish background, or at least a God-fearing Gentile background, because the early church at this point, there were a lot of Gentiles in the church by this point, but a lot of them had come from backgrounds where they were going to the synagogue. And so, there were women in the synagogue, and they knew how they were supposed to behave in terms of orderliness in the synagogue. So I don't know. I've never thought that really makes a lot of sense. Another one would be that this is specific to Corinthian women. This really only applies to the Corinthian church. And that has to do with something going on with them. And it could be that maybe the nature of the context is, sort of the charismata, these manifestations of spirit, and speaking in tongues and prophecy and whatnot, and that maybe it was that the women were getting ecstatic, right? That this was common in pagan worship practices to sort of kind of get out of hand and that sort of thing, and so maybe they're kind of getting that way, and that's why he's saying this to them, and certainly that is a possibility, that this is not a general prohibition of women in in the church. It just has to do with orderliness in the context of the Corinthian church. The problem with that view is that it really does, the language in and around these two verses really does seem to be a general application, and as in all the churches, right? And it's just using that kind of language that it doesn't really kind of have that feel to it of this just applies to the Corinthians. It has more of a specific feel of general application. So I mean, I've read a lot of these different views, and I just read another one this summer. We did Allegiance to the King this summer, did a book review of one of Greg Keener's books on Paul, Women and Wives, I think is the title of the book. And and he spends quite a bit of time on this particular explanation, but I didn't really feel like he's knocking it out of the park. I don't think the explanation is the best. So, all right. I want to show you, like I said before, I have in the past typically taught the later insertion view, because I felt like, I'm in sort of good territory. There's a lot of big name commentators. They're all going that route. There's reasons to believe that, and contextually, especially, it just doesn't. I don't. It doesn't fit. It doesn't make sense. But recently, I've come to believe that there's another explanation, and there's a number of commentators that are beginning to put forth this view, and I think this is it. I think this is the right way to understand that, and that is that this is a prohibition against wives judging their husbands' prophecies. Okay, a prohibition against wives judging their husbands' prophecies. All right, well, where are you getting that from, right? So let's dig in. What we need to do is we need to dig into the immediate context and understand what it is that we're actually talking about when we get to verses 34 and 35. And that begins in verse 29. Let me read verse 29 through 33. Have 2 or 3 prophets speak, and have the others pass judgment. But if a revelation is made to another who is seated, then the first one is to keep silent. For you can all prophesy one by one, so that all may learn and all may be exhorted. And the spirits of prophets are subject to prophets. For God is not a God of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. This particular phrase could go with the previous statement, for God is not a God of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. Or it could go with the latter statement, women must keep silent in the church. You can see here the NASB 2020 has put a period in front of the word as. So what they're concluding is it actually goes with the women part. So it would be, for God is not a God of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints, women should keep silent. And so, but it's a little tricky to tell which way you should go with that. But looking at verses 29 through 33, we have the setup for what this is actually talking about. And here's the problem, and I think this is why for a long time I didn't see this, is I think most people think that the context of 29 really through 36 is prophesying, and that this is about prophesying. And in a sort of way it is, but it's not really about prophesying. It's about judging prophecies. And so I want to take you through a little, piece by piece in this. I actually have other teachings that I've done on Holy Spirit Night that I'm sure one of them is recorded, that you can go and see on discerning of spirits. You'll find a lot of the same information a little bit more in depth. So the first is that the 2 words pass judgment, that is a single Greek word. It's diakrino, and it is the verb form of the word that's used in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 10, that is typically translated distinguishing. If you've got King James Version in the back of your brain like I do, then you think discerning of spirits, right? So when you're going through that list of the manifestation of the Spirit and the 9 different things that Paul lists out there, knowledge and wisdom and faith and miracles and healing and all that stuff, he gets to prophecies or prophecy, and then he lists distinguishing of spirits. And the distinguishing there is the noun form of this word. It's diakrisis, and it's same word. It's just the noun form and the verb form. Just like you have a noun form, faith, and a verb form to believe, or to believing, that kind of thing. It's the same word. It's just 2 different. It's the verb and noun forms. And so that's first, is that in 1 Corinthians 12, this is actually listed as one of those 9 things that of the ways in which the Spirit will manifest. And so it's actually, verse 30 kind of clues you in. But if a revelation is made, in other words, I am judging the prophecy to see if this is a real prophecy or not. The diakrino and diakrisis, they mean to discern or judge between things, right? In this case, what is right, what is wrong? Is this a prophecy from God or not? Is this really from this person's own mind, or maybe even a demonic source? That kind of thing, or is it really from God? And so that's the first thing, is that it's the same word as that manifestation. And then when it says, but if a revelation is made to another who is seated, then the first one is to keep silent. This is the same word that's used in verse 34 of the women. And this is actually a key term that's linking this whole passage together. We actually saw it before, having to do with somebody who's going to speak in tongues, but they're not going to interpret. Then they need to do this. And I'll get in a minute. I'll get a little bit more in depth into that. But that's the same term. So here, if a revelation is made to the person who's judging, this is not from the Lord, then the person who is speaking, they need to reveal that, and the person who's speaking needs to stop speaking. They need to stop. Then verse 31, for you can all prophesy one by one, that all may learn, all may be exhorted, and the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. Okay, so spirits of the prophets, that word spirit in this context means the prophecies of the prophets. That word spirit is used figuratively for the word prophecy under certain conditions. That's again 1 Corinthians 12:10. It's distinguishing of spirits. To another prophecy, to another distinguishing of spirits. But this is not the only places that it's used that way. A really good place to see this in action is 1 John 4:1, where it says, "Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world." And so you could just see it directly used here, that this was a term that the writers of the New Testament understood. It. Spirit is actually a really flexible word, and it has a lot of different meanings in the New Testament. You really have to pay attention to context to understand what it's referring to. And in this particular case, though, it's referring to those prophecies, judging those prophecies. So in verse 32, and the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. That, again, what are we talking about here? We're talking about orderliness. We're talking about things not getting out of hand, being under a responsible level of control. And while at the same time allowing for this spirit to move, right? That we're not just going to toss the baby out with the bathwater, that the spirits of the prophets, the prophecies of the prophets, are subject to these other prophets, right? And the word prophets here is not being used in terms of like some sort of office or something like this. These are just people who are going to prophesy. And so 2 or 3 prophets can speak. In fact, you could have more than that. He says that for you can all prophesy one by one, right? And that would be okay, as long as others are utilizing this other power of the Spirit, which is to listen to God for revelation, to see, is this really from him or not? That there's spiritual judgment taking place. And then we see in that last section that the purpose of this is to maintain order and peace in the church, right? So for God is not a God of confusion, again, which has to do with the orderliness, but of peace. That this is the way this whole prophecy thing needs to happen, is it needs to be coupled with distinguishing of spirits, distinguishing of those prophecies, to make sure they're really from the Lord. And so there's going to be other people listening to that prophet, that person who's prophesying, and they're going to be discerning in their spirit and judging it, and they might stop them in the middle of it and say, okay, wait, I'm kind of getting something a little different here. I feel like the Lord is saying this, that's not quite correct. Let's talk about that for a minute. That needs to occur. Okay. So then at that point is when we get to verse 34. And remember, verse 36 is actually going to wrap up the section on when it says, but what? Did the word of God come to you only? In other words, addressing the idea that you can't be judged. Of course you can be judged. These other people can receive it as well, right? And so this is a team effort here. And that actually wraps up this little section on distinguishing of spirits. And 34 and 35 is right in the middle of that. All right. So what's the interpretation then? How then do we fit these two verses into that context? So we're going to read the verses again, and I want you to keep in mind what we just read, that what we're talking about is this idea of judging the prophecies, that when someone prophesies, and we want them to do that others are operating in the Spirit, this power, which really is just simply asking God for the discernment, right? So I'm praying for God to give me the discernment about this prophecy spiritually so that I can know, is this really from him or not? Some cases it might be really easy maybe I don't even need revelation if it directly contradicts some general thing of the scripture. Like if someone were to prophesy, well, Jesus was not raised from the dead, I don't need revelation, right? I know what the scripture says on that, and it's very clear. But in a lot of cases with prophecy, especially if it's more of a personal, immediate nature, how do you know that it's really from God or not? Somebody else is saying, right? Well, you need to discern that in your spirit, that, oh yeah, that's really from him. So, okay, bearing that in mind, then we enter into verse 34. In that context, the women are to keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but are to subject themselves, just as the law also says, if they desire to learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is improper for a woman to speak in church. So we're dealing with two levels of context here. This has to do with orderliness, because that's the greater context. All this spiritual stuff, Paul's trying to create some order in the house, right? And so he's dealing with a bunch of different issues. But in the more immediate context, the issue is prophecies being how you apply orderliness to prophesying is through distinguishing of spirits. And then we get into this. So we need to understand both the point here is orderliness, and specifically that distinguishing of spirits is to be utilized with prophesying. So let's think about that for a minute. Okay. First of all, you should know that women in Greek, women and wives are the same Greek word. It's a Greek word gune or guni, wherever gine or whatever it is. There's different ways of pronouncing depending on your preference. But I always use gune. And that term is the generic term for women, but it's also the term for wives. And so how do you know which is it? Well, it's you're going to have to tell from context. The same is true for men and husbands, that this is a Greek word in air, and it's men, a male person, or a husband, and there's no differentiation between them. There's nothing to tell you other than context, which is being talked about. So when we look back through here and we're thinking about that, we can see the women, generic, are to keep silent. But if they desire to learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home. Well, that creates some problems because some women didn't have husbands. Their husbands were dead. And it's funny to me that the translators are doing this, that they're flipping it, and they know that these are the same words. And so they're actually, through their translation, trying to say, well, the first part is, it's general women, but they need to ask their husbands, and most of the women had husbands, right? Yeah, a lot of them did, but a lot of them were widows too, or young women who weren't married yet. And so, okay, why not be consistent? Either you're going to say women are to keep silent in the churches and ask their men at home, or you need to put it, wives are to keep silent in the churches and ask their husbands at home. And either way would work fine for the context, because if you just use generic women and men, well, then the men in that case you could have a daughter-father relationship, or an uncle ward relationship, that kind of thing. A lot of different things could go on in that scenario. But I'm going to just say, okay, let's be consistent and use wives and husbands, and make it clear to the English reader that that's what's happening. The wives are to keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but are to subject themselves, just as the law also says. If they desire to learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is improper for a wife to speak in church. Okay, well, now we're beginning to narrow down application here and say, okay, it's people who are in this relationship, and we need to understand, okay, this relationship that's occurring, how that applies in this context of distinguishing of spirits. Okay. The phrase keep silent, we've seen this before. It either means to stop speaking or to refrain from speaking. When we saw the first occurrence of it back when it was in the context of speaking in tongues, it meant refrain from speaking. They haven't done it yet. If they're not going to interpret, then they need to refrain from speaking, and in that case, speaking in tongues. And then we saw with the prophet, the people prophesying, that the person who's speaking first, and someone else comes along and says, "Oh, wait a minute, I'm getting a revelation from God. That's not, that the judgment of this is not prophecy. This is something else. That it's not genuine." That the first person, then same word, needs to stop speaking. So you have to ask yourself, okay, is this stop speaking or refrain from speaking, right? Well, it definitely seems like it's refrain from speaking. They're not speaking yet, but then you have to ask, refrain why? And in what way? If this is a general prohibition, it would be some sort of why of just women are not allowed to speak in the church. It seems very strange. And the thing about the law also, and subjecting themselves, as the law also says, if it's general, that's really hard to make any kind of case for, because it doesn't exist in the Old Testament. There certainly is stuff going on in the Old Testament, especially with concern of subjection in household relationships like husbands and wives. Absolutely. So it seems to be, again, this narrower scope of refraining from speaking in the context that we're talking about. Okay. And specifically, that wives are to refrain from speaking in the context that we're talking about. Next, subject themselves. I think this is important to make this point. It's a minor in the whole scope of things, but I think it's important. This is the woman is doing this herself. It's not somebody else putting this on her. This is that she is choosing this orderliness, this particular orderliness. And when it says, just as the law says, we need to understand, okay, there's something going on here that God is wanting in terms of them subjecting themselves in this interaction. And again, if it's husbands and wives, okay, there's certainly things along those lines, that where wives subject themselves to their husbands. We see that in Ephesians 5, for instance. But again, what's our context? Our context is distinguishing of spirits, that somebody's going to speak up and put a stop to a prophecy that is not from God. Okay, let's keep going. The phrases desire to learn and let them ask. These are really interesting terms being used here. If they desire to learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home. Now, the way that this is translated, and there are different ways to translate this, the way that it's translated, it makes you think that, okay, she doesn't know something, and so she's maybe interrupting the meeting because she wants to know something, and maybe she needs to go home to her husband and ask her. That's the whole disruptive thing, right? And but here's the problem. First of all, like the word ask, for instance, there's a different word in Greek than this one that would be more general like that. This is a different word that in the context of a judging scenario becomes a very different meaning in English, and you would definitely translate it differently. So let me give you that. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Well, first the word learn, that desire to learn. Let's look at this one. This is that word in Acts 23:27. When this man was seized by the Jews, this is Paul, and was about to be killed by them, I, the centurion giving a report, I came up to them with the troops and rescued him after learning that he was a Roman. Now, this is a funny statement because if you know the story, he didn't rescue him after he learned that he was a Roman. He came and he grabbed him because the crowd was getting ready to stone him and stuff like that, and so the Romans are going to stop this riot from happening, and they grab him, and what do? They're going to flog him to find out what he did to make this crowd so angry, right? That's what's going to happen. But before they get the chance to flog him, he asks the question, well, are you going to flog a Roman citizen before any kind of trial or whatever? And that was dangerous to the soldiers to do something like that. They could get in very serious trouble for doing that. And so he's got this report, right? And he says, I came up to them with the troops and rescued him after learning that he was a Roman. Well, how did he learn that he was a Roman? As because he was getting ready to flog it out of him, right? He wanted to know the reasoning for this stuff. And so he's in that context. So the learning there has to do not just, well, I've gone to school and I've learned, or, hey, I learned a lesson or something like that. This specific learning that's taking place is that the idea that I have uncovered something important, and it's going to make a change in this situation, right? And we see that. So it can have that sort of effect, which would kind of fit within our context of distinguishing of spirits. Somebody, they learn something, they get something, right? And we have a desire for that, right? So we're supposed to desire to prophesy. We're supposed to desire distinguishing of spirits as well, to learn in that context. I need to learn from you, Lord. Is this really from you or not? Because it can dramatically affect the outcome of this situation. The second, and this is the ask, and this is no ordinary ask, right? In the context of judging, here's Mark 14:60 through 61. This Jesus has been brought before the high priest. And then the high priest stood up and came forward and questioned Jesus. The questioned, that's our word, saying, do you not offer any answer for what these men are testifying against you? Verse 61, but he kept silent and did not offer an answer. Again, the high priest was questioning him, there's our word again, and said to him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? So this is actually, this particular word, it can mean to ask a question, but in the context of a trial or judging or that kind of thing, it means to interrogate, right? It's what attorneys do when they're interrogating a witness, right? Or the police are going to bring somebody in for questioning. That's what this term means when it's used in this context of trying to uncover something, to investigate it. Just like in the Roman soldier, he was going to do that by flogging. He was going to question him by flogging. And so if we then are bringing all these ideas into, we can read the last verse in light of the context, in light of what we learned, as it is improper or shameful, is what this word actually means. Shameful for a woman to speak, or I'm sorry, I wrote woman, I meant to write wife. For a wife to speak in this way, the way that we're talking about in the church. What way? In terms of judging a prophecy. Now, is that anybody? I don't think so. I think it's her husband. That's what we're dealing with right here. If she is desiring to judge the prophecy of her husband, she needs to refrain from that. And instead, if she does feel like maybe not, just interrogate him at home, right? Don't do it in the church, right? And it doesn't take very long once you hear that explanation to go, oh yeah, okay, that could be problematic from a whole bunch of different angles, right? Not necessarily that any woman with any man, that would be a problem, but between a husband and wife, oh yeah, that could definitely be a problem. That could definitely be a problem going the other direction, a husband doing that to a wife. In the context of this culture, maybe not, certainly in our culture, it would be, because in that culture, it was shameful for a husband in public to be correcting for a wife to be correcting her husband. It would have been shocking to a lot of people, right? And not only that, but you get a lot of relationship dynamics between husbands and wives, right? And you can have situations where a wife, for instance, is the husband is prophesying, and he prophesies something, and she's going, in her mind, she's thinking, I can't even believe he's saying that. That is so hypocritical. It's just unbelievable. I got to stop him, right? You're saying this stuff, but I know you at home, and you don't even come close to, that kind of thing, right? Maybe it's a behavior that he has that makes her really mad, right? You have so much more intimacy between husbands and wives that judging that prophecy in public, there's a real possibility that she's judging from her own mind, right? Because of the closeness of that relationship and the dynamics that can be going on. So, in other words, Paul is saying, I have a prohibition against a wife doing this thing that I'm talking about to her husband in the church setting. Doesn't mean she can't do it. She might, just save it when you get home. If you think you're hearing something else from the Lord, talk it over with your husband, right? And so I think this is a really, really good explanation for several reasons. I think one, it allows for the really pretty strong evidence that these two verses are actually genuine to the text, while not creating a situation where Paul is directly contradicting himself in this sort of crazy way. It offers up a really good contextual explanation in that this is the context we're talking about. What is the speaking that's being talked about here? It's the judging of the prophecy that's being spoken, and whether or not that person, is really speaking for the Lord, and if that needs to stop because the judgment of other spiritual people sitting by is saying that that's not really from the Lord. I'm getting that in my spirit, and that in that context, this really, we don't need to be doing this with wives and their husbands. And so all around, it just creates a much more reasonable explanation than I think a lot of other explanations, while at the same time maintaining the textual integrity of the scriptures. And so I think this is it. I think this is the explanation. Now, I could be wrong, and some people may disagree or have a different view or whatever, but for me, I find this to be a very satisfying view of this particular passage. All right, so let me stop sharing here and open it up for questions and discussion. And
Um,
if you don't know it, there's a raise hand function in Zoom. It's in the reactions button at the bottom. If you're on your computer, if you're on a phone or something, you'll have to navigate around and find it. But you'll see raise hand, and you can raise your hand, and I'll call on you. Yeah, Donna.
that's very interesting. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I've heard all these other versions, and I've those other churches I mentioned, women actually did that to their husbands right in front of me. And somebody had to say, hey, pipe down, not now, how disruptive. And, the whole church is looking at her, and I have a friend that did it all the time. And I remember saying to her, hey, you know what? Your behavior in church, I mean, you get on your, I mean, that is very, that's just so wrong. I mean, everybody's looking at you like, you're dogging your husband, doubting. It's just, I mean, my God, how do you have any relation? And of course, they had relationship problems because of her bossiness and her false judgment. And I remember dealing with this woman. She's still a sort of a friend of mine today. And she just, the know-it-all and doing that in church. I've seen it done. And I don't think I ever did it to not in church. I might have had conversations after I got home. And it wasn't about prophecies, but I remember my husband confronting me about certain judgments, and a pastor of a church took him aside and said, your wife is definitely walking with the Lord Jesus. Why are you dismissing what she's saying? I found her, to be very credible, give a listen, give her, I mean, what's wrong with you? And, superiority attitudes and stuff. And it was a real go with the husband that I now have. He doesn't do that anymore, by the way. Lesson learned. And he does listen. And I'm thankful that he came out of that. But, I've been on the receiving end by a man, and it was very hostile. It was very, I mean, I just felt choked. And so, having experienced this makes a lot of sense to me, John.
Yeah, I just,
My two
I think
cents worth.
I think it does too. So I'll tell you what happened was I was in a conversation with someone, and we were talking about this section, and I was still in my thinking, that it's not original to the text, it's an insertion. But I got into explaining the context, and as I was explaining the context, this is not really about prophesying, it's about discerning of spirits. It hit me. Oh, wait, what if that's what it means? That's what the wife
Mhm.
is not supposed to do discerning of spirits to her husband. And so then what I find out is, oh yeah, no, there's a bunch of scholars today. They're all talking about that there's like, oh yeah, this is definitely the context. This is really the best explanation of this section. I was like, oh, okay. Kind of feel like Paul going to Jerusalem just to confirm. Am I right? I don't,
Yeah, I know. I like it. I really fits in the context with prophecies and discernment. And now that I think about it, yeah, I thought of that too. I thought, is this like just been stuck in here? I had that original idea. Somebody just stuck that in there because this is about prophecies in the church and discerning those prophecies. And I never put it together, sort of stuck in that, that I don't really know what to think of this, God. It doesn't seem right. But, now that you've kind of distinguished and, we can get a right translation of this, it fits with the entire context, which is prophecy, men and women, husbands and wives, so yeah, it makes sense.
Cool. Edgardo.
Yes, Jen, I think your explanation is very logical and rational, because I don't believe that Apostle Paul here is stopping the women or the wives from speaking. I believe it's the right words there is to refrain from speaking, because it would add chaos to the noisy meetings already, because there are a lot of people who are prophesying already. And if Apostle Paul is saying that they should stop from speaking, why did the Apostle Paul allow them to pray and prophesy in the 11th chapter, verse 5
Yeah.
of First Corinthians. And then here, in, the, in verse 39, the encouragement to prophesy, it's also stated here. So I think it's the right interpretation that Apostle Paul was trying to uh, make the order to really exist in the meetings by telling the women to really, the wives to really refrain from speaking for a while, and if they have questions, it's time to give questions when they're already in the house and ask the husband about it. Good explanation, John. Good interpretation that you have there. I like it. Very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Edgardo. Daryl.
Yes, 2 points. First one, Jackson doesn't have a good mic, but he wrote, why did the translators translate woman, husband in this way to start with?
Yeah, I read his thing there. It's a good question. You know, why? You know, I can guess at why did they do that. But you know, it's hard to say exactly because it's not like there's some sort of textual indicator, grammatical, syntactical. There's no indicators, right? It only context can tell you whether you should say women or wives, or whether you say men or husbands. And so here's what I think. This is my opinion, and take it for what it's worth, which is not very much, but I think this is probably what's going on for the translators, is that it's really hard to translate. Translation is very, very, very challenging. Because there's when you're translating from one language to another, if those languages aren't super close to each other, like a Spanish and French or something like that, then your choices that you make are really almost never going to be 100% communicating what's in the original meaning. And so I personally think it's probably should be women and men, with the cultural understanding that the men in question are whoever that woman, whatever household she's in, right? So typically, with very few exceptions, there were wealthier Roman women. This didn't really apply, but typically throughout the Greco-Roman world, women were always in the household of a man. If she was married, then she was in the household of her husband. If she wasn't married yet, she would be in the household of her father or some male relative. Her father was dead. Whatever male relative was the head of the household. That could, again, it could be an uncle, could be a brother, could even be a cousin. It just depended on the family situation. And so that you'd have that relational dynamic in all of those situations. If you're going to translate it husbands and wives, and you should understand it that way as well. See, this is the problem with translation. The minute you or I translate it husbands and wives, we will not think of those other relationships. The minute we translate it men and women, we won't think, we'll get confused altogether, right? And because we don't have the language thinking of the terminology in the culture. So it's really, really hard to translate. So I think what they're trying to do here is help the reader to understand that it's not just wives, but with the use of husbands, we're going to sort of try and show it's a familial relationship here, because there's not a really good way to do that in English, the way that you just use the terms in Greek and it's automatic. Now, again, who knows? Maybe it's, they're translating it that way for some totally other reason. It's there are some translations where you can get to those kind of notes, but so that's hopefully I answered Jackson's question. if I didn't, Jackson, put in the chat. I definitely want to. Okay. All right. Good.
Secondly, real quick, I don't want to take too much time here. I
okay.
enjoyed your presentation, and I appreciate you saying, John, that in Romans 11, women were allowed to speak in the church. So that's one reason this passage here cannot be a contradiction. It can't be, Paul's not taking back what he said earlier. And also, I was thinking the earlier church setting, they met in people's houses. And how could it been a place of fellowship and communion if the woman couldn't even speak? It just seems to be at odds with the whole New Testament. So I agree. I think that your interpretation, I think it's the best that I've heard to explain this passage. So thank you.
I think the one of the things about that idea, I'd apply what you said as well to the concept of, well, it doesn't mean that women can't speak at all, but they're not to speak with authority. They're not to teach or be, get up in front and speak with authority to the church, that sort of thing. And it has the same contradiction with 1 Corinthians 11, because really a genuine prophecy, there really isn't higher authority than that in the church. If God is really speaking to you, well, then that has the weight of God behind it. It's, if a woman gives a genuine prophecy from the Lord to someone, they better listen. She absolutely has authority. Prophets themselves, and there are definitely women and prophets, we see that throughout the scriptures, they have more authority in the church than pastors do. So, well, I mean, it's just a complete contradiction either way. And so we should immediately reject those explanations and find better ones. Yeah. Let's see. Inti.
All right, I'm just gonna throw this out there because I could be totally wrong, because I'm not very knowledgeable in this subject. But does it go the other way around too? Right? Because God is a like he said, God is a God of orderliness. And what if a wife prophesied? I mean, it's encouraged, isn't it encouraged that we all prophesy? Wouldn't it make sense to kind of go that way? Or is there like a cultural undertone I'm missing?
There is cultural stuff going on. There's definitely in their culture, generally speaking, a husband correcting his wife would not have caused a stir in the community. Probably would have if they had a particularly bad dynamic and everybody knew it. And you might have one of those situations like Donna was talking about, where the pastor takes the guy aside and said, you know what, you do that at home. So culturally, yeah, that probably, but then that just means that culturally in other places and conditions, yeah, it absolutely could go the other way, where a husband doing that to his wife really wouldn't be appropriate. And if you think about modern societies that are largely egalitarian with men and women, then yeah, it's probably in our culture, for instance, probably does apply both ways, most if not all of the time. And certainly, understanding the passage now, I've thought about this. I thought, oh, you know what? I should probably not do this with my wife, Lisa, for the same reasons. It was very different culture, very different situation that they were dealing with. I will say this. I learned something many, many years ago. Actually, when I was going through marriage counseling, I learned this, and then I've seen it over the years, over and over again, that one of the differences between men and women, that not 100% of the time, but definitely generally true, is that women tend towards physical modesty and men tends towards emotional modesty. And what that means is you probably have seen this. Let's say you're in a restaurant with your wife or girlfriend or whatever, and something emotional happens. Maybe you're in the middle of an argument, for instance. generally speaking, again, this is not universally true, women are more likely to raise their voice and make a stink and make a scene, right? And men, generally speaking, are not, because of that, of this emotional modesty thing. And so you have a little bit of that at play, where it's more likely that a husband is not going to create a public scene because of his own emotional modesty than it is a wife. And so I think in our modern society, yeah, it does apply both ways. But kind of like all things, you know, there's a number of instructions in the New Testament that are given to men that are not given to women. And it's because, generally speaking, women don't have a problem with that. So you kind of have that at play as well, NT.
Okay.
Phyllis or Steve or both.
I had a question. When it comes to, we've discussed that we're reading Paul now, but at that time, when Paul would reason with the people, he would always reason with them from the Old Testament. Many times he would go back to the Old Testament and he would reason with them out of the Old Testament. So when it says that, and I don't have my glasses, but it was about, I think verses 33 and 34, when it says, as the law also says, what was Paul looking at in the Old Testament to prove this case that he's trying to say here?
So if, all right, so if I set the context to this idea of, a husband and wife relationship where we're doing this judging of another person and publicly about what they're saying, and you have a husband and wife situation. This gets tricky, and it's tricky in the New Testament, where you have boundary lines between church relationships and authority, church authority and stuff like that, and the church realm, and the household relationships and household realm and authority and that kind of stuff. And so whereas in the church, in Christ, there is no male or female, right? Galatians 3. And you see female apostles, and you see them as female prophets, and they're going around, they're serving in the church and all this kind of stuff. And but very clearly you see in the marriage relationship, you do see this, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands in everything as unto the Lord, right? And you see talking about, Peter talks about it. So you, in the household set of relationships, you do have this sort of distinct gender-based authority relationship. We'd have to spend a lot more time on it, because it needs to be caveated with remembering that God views authority structures upside down from the way the world views authority structures, right? Where Jesus is in charge, but he's going to wash your feet. He's going to go to the cross for you, right? That kind of stuff. So you got to caveat it with that. It's not like the world, but there is a distinctions made there. And so I would just say, so understanding all that, how then do you take this thing where he's referring to the law? And one thing you should know is that the law can mean everything from the 10 Commandments to the entire Old Testament. Generally speaking, it either refers to the Mosaic Covenant or the books of Moses. but it can refer to the Psalms. I mean, just anything in the Old Testament, because the word law in Bible speak, it's basically the translation of the term in the Old Testament, and the term in the Old Testament means instructions. It doesn't mean what we think of as law. Some instructions are laws, but a lot of them are not laws, they're instructions. And so, okay, so there's some instruction in the Old Testament about the fact that this relationship dynamic has a difference between just regular men and women stuff going on, and that there can be a problem in that would necessitate the submission in order to have orderliness. And so what I think it's probably Genesis 3 in that case, where God says there's going to be this dynamic where the wife is going to be in this struggle with her husband of authority.
Yeah,
And
Genesis 3:16.
16, yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's probably the best I can do. I have yet to see anything along the lines of a like a rock solid, oh no, it's definitely talking about Psalm 42 verse 7, and here's why, right? So that's my best explanation.
Thank you, John. This was, I had never heard this take on it before, but it makes sense. It really does. And, Joel said that the sons and the daughters would prophesy. And so it's just, yeah, this is good. Thank you. Really gives you something to think about.
Yeah.
This was always such a negative experience for so many women in the church.
Yeah. I'm gonna wrap up. I just say one quick thing before I close out the recording, is to remember that at the beginning of this, I wanted to make a point about how important context is to understanding what's being said. And we saw tonight that once we understood that context, we allow that context to control our understanding of verses 34 and 35, suddenly they make a lot more sense. And that's just so true. A big one that you could point to is Paul's usage of works of the law. If you've got works of the law, and works of the law is a specific thing. It doesn't mean just any kind of works, right? It's not talking about good works. It's works of the law. And once you understand that that's what he's talking about, and then you keep that in your head as you read through those sections, even when he just says works in the same context, that what are we talking about? We're talking about works of the law. Suddenly you can take away contradictions between Paul and the rest of the New Testament. And, contradictions between Paul and Jesus and James and John and Peter and the writer of Hebrews and all that kind of stuff. So it's really, really important to remember context that should always be understood, so that as we're reading, we're keeping that in mind, and we'll come to better understanding of what we're reading. And so with that, I'll close it out. Really, if you're listening to this or watching this on YouTube, we really appreciate it. And we appreciate it when you like and subscribe and follow us on Facebook and all that kind of good stuff. But what we really would like to see is your face here in our midst. So come join us.